On a beach in the Central Pacific in the summer of 1944, more than 70,000 young Americans, most of them United States Marines, were fighting for their lives. Most of them were 19, 20, 21 years old. Their mothers had said goodbye to them at train stations 6 months earlier. In tens of thousands of American homes that summer, small service flags with a blue star hung in the front window. In some of those homes, the blue star would be replaced by a gold star before the year was out. 100 miles offshore, in a small quiet cabin aboard the American heavy cruiser USS Indianapolis, a 57-year-old admiral stood alone at a chart table and made a decision that would decide, in part, who lived and who died on that beach. His own carrier commanders begged him to make the opposite choice. Some of their pilots would carry their anger with them for decades. Some of them would go to their graves believing he had let a great victory slip away. He never wrote a memoir. He never publicly defended himself. He never explained. But if he had chosen wrong, if he had listened to the men who begged him to attack, thousands of American troops on the beaches of Saipan might have woken up the next mornings filled with Japanese guns. He did not choose wrong. He turned his back on the fleeing enemy. He sailed east, and he stood between the sea and the men on the sand. This is the story of the loneliest decision of the Pacific War. This is the story of a quiet man named Raymond Spruance. To understand what he did, you have to understand what was at stake. In the spring of 1944, the United States launched Operation Forager, the largest amphibious campaign the Pacific had yet seen. Over 500 ships, around 127,000 men committed to the campaign, with more than 70,000 of them slated for the assault on Saipan alone, drawn from the 2nd Marine Division, the 4th Marine Division, and the Army's 27th Infantry Division. Transports loaded with troops, landing craft loaded with tanks, ammunition ships, fuel ships, hospital ships, all of them exposed, all of them dependent on the fleet that was supposed to protect them. The objective was the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, Guam. From an airfield on Saipan, the new B-29 Superfortress bombers could reach Tokyo. If the Marianas fell, the war would enter a new phase. On the morning of June 15th, the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions stormed the beaches of Saipan under a hail of Japanese artillery. That same day, on the far side of the Pacific, an American submarine named the USS Flying Fish surfaced in the waters near the San Bernardino Strait and radioed a report that changed everything. Major Japanese warships steaming east, steaming toward the Marianas. The Japanese combined fleet was coming. At Pearl Harbor, Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz received the report and did not flinch. He issued instructions to Raymond Spruance that would define the entire battle. The written orders emphasized that Spruance's primary mission was the protection of the amphibious operation at Saipan and the defeat of enemy naval forces that threatened it, in that order. The mission was to protect the Marines and soldiers. The mission was to keep the transports safe. The mission was to hold the beachhead until the island was taken. And here is the first thing you must understand about what happened next. Most of the officers in Task Force 58, the great carrier strike force under Vice Admiral Mark Mitscher, focused on the second half of that mission far more than the first. They believed they were fighting to sink Japanese ships. Spruance knew he was fighting to protect American lives. This is where the argument begins. Now let us meet the three men whose collision of judgment would define the next 72 hours. Raymond Ames Spruance, 57 years old. Born in Baltimore, Maryland in 1886. Graduate of the United States Naval Academy, class of 1906. Slight of build, quiet of voice. He was not a naval aviator. He had never commanded a carrier from the air. He now commanded the largest fleet the United States had ever put to sea. Those who served with him left a consistent picture. He walked the deck of his flagship for miles each day, often 8 to 10 miles, and used those long walks to think. His officers learned not to interrupt him. When Raymond Spruance was walking, Raymond Spruance was making decisions. He preferred simple routines. He drank little. He did not smoke. He read history and studied doctrine as if he were still a student at the Naval War College, where he had served 3 tours as student and instructor between the wars. He believed something Nimitz had taught him during the darkest days of 1942. Calculated risk, not gambling, not caution, calculated risk. 2 years earlier at Midway, Spruance had followed that doctrine to a legendary victory. His pilots had destroyed 4 Japanese carriers in a single afternoon, and then, with the enemy in retreat and some of his own staff urging him to pursue, he had turned east through the night, away from the wounded Japanese fleet. Some officers questioned that call at the time. History has been kinder. Somewhere in the darkness to the west, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had been advancing with a battle line of heavy warships, hoping for a night surface engagement. Spruance had not walked into it. Now, 2 years later, in the same ocean, in the same kind of darkness, with the same kind of staff urging him to attack, he was being asked to make a similar decision all over again. Mark Andrew Mitscher, 57 years old, the opposite of Spruance in almost every way that mattered. He was thin, small, weathered by 3 decades in the sea wind. He wore a long billed cap turned backwards on his head so the bill would not block his view of the aircraft coming into land, and Mark Mitscher rarely took his eyes off the aircraft coming into land. He was Naval Aviator number 33, one of the first pilots the United States Navy had ever trained. He had been flying since 1915. He had commanded the USS Hornet at Midway. He had launched the Doolittle Raiders on their one-way trip to Tokyo. He had lost more pilots than any other American commander in the Pacific to that point, and by every account of those who served with him, he loved his aircrews, the way a father loves his sons. Beside him stood Captain Arleigh Burke, 42 years old, Chief of Staff, a destroyer man by trade, recently reassigned to carrier operations, aggressive, brilliant, sharp-tongued. Burke had earned the nickname 31-Knot Burke, commanding destroyer squadrons in the Solomons. The messages that came out of Mitscher's flagship in the coming days would carry his fingerprints. And then there was the enemy. Jisaburo Ozawa, 57 years old, 6 foot 3 inches tall, the tallest admiral in the Imperial Japanese Navy. A quiet, thoughtful man who had inherited a badly weakened fleet. He commanded 9 aircraft carriers and roughly 450 aircraft. On paper, an enormous force. In reality, a shadow of what it had been. His pilots had, on average, only a few months of His experienced airmen had been dying in the skies over Rabaul, Truk, and the Solomons for over a year. His fuel was so scarce that his ships had been forced to burn unrefined Borneo crude oil, which produced dangerous vapors and turned engine rooms into hazards. But Ozawa had one real advantage, and he meant to use it. Japanese carrier aircraft generally had greater range than their American counterparts. He could strike from roughly 300 miles away, while the Americans could reach him only at around 200. He had also planned to use the airfields on Guam and Rota, behind the American fleet, as staging bases. His planes would attack Task Force 58, continue east, land on the Marianas airfields, refuel, rearm, and strike again on the return leg. He would fight from a range where the enemy could not reach him. It was a good plan. It was already in ruins. Because for days before the battle began, Mark Mitscher's carriers had been pounding every airfield on Guam and Rota. Runways cratered, hangars burning, aircraft caught on the ground. Ozawa did not fully know the extent of the damage. He was steaming east, believing his airfields still offered a safe landing. They largely did not, and so the two fleets moved toward each other. Spruance did not yet know Ozawa's precise location. Ozawa had a better idea of where Spruance was because Japanese radio intelligence had intercepted American transmissions and estimated the position of Task Force 58. The mouse could see, roughly, where the cat was. The cat could not yet see the mouse. On the 17th of June, Mitscher proposed moving west during the night to be within striking range of the Japanese fleet at dawn. Spruance declined. He declined because Rear Admiral Joseph J. Clark, 50 years old, called Jocko by everyone who knew him, was still bringing Task Group 58.1 back from a raid on the Bonin Islands. Spruance would not attack until his fleet was concentrated. He would not divide his forces. He would not give the enemy an opening. Then Vice Admiral Willis Lee, 56 years old, sent Mitscher a message that mattered. Lee commanded the fast battleships of Task Group 58.77 of the most powerful warships in the Pacific. He was the finest gunnery officer in the United States Navy. And he told Mitscher, in plain language, that he did not want a night surface engagement with the Japanese. His crews were not trained for it. The Japanese had proven at Guadalcanal that they were dangerous night fighters. Willis Lee, the man whose entire purpose was to fight surface battles, did not want to fight this one at night. That reluctance from a commander like Lee was significant. It reached Spruance, and on the flag bridge of the Indianapolis, the quiet admiral stopped walking, folded his hands behind his back, and looked west into the gathering dark. He was 57 years old. He commanded the most powerful fleet ever put to sea. He had tens of thousands of American troops on a beach behind him. He had over 500 ships to protect. He had a Japanese admiral somewhere out there in the black water, planning something he could not yet see, and he had a decision to make. By dawn on June 18, 1944, 3 men stood on 3 different bridges in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and each was about to make choices that would follow him for the rest of his life. One would be dead within 3 years. One would live to be 83. And the enemy, the third of them, would carry his defeat home to Japan and refer to himself until the end of his life in 1966 as a defeated admiral. This is what happened in the next 72 hours. Spruance had spent nearly 40 years studying the Imperial Japanese Navy. He had read their doctrine. He had watched them fight at Java Sea, at Coral Sea, at Midway, and in nearly every one of those battles, they had shown a strong preference for the same idea. Divide the enemy's attention. Approach from more than one direction. Draw the main fighting force away from what actually needed to be protected. Spruance correctly anticipated the Japanese tendency to use diversionary forces, a pattern he had studied for years. He could not prove that Ozawa would try it this time. He had no confirmed intelligence report telling him so. He had only the pattern of a lifetime of study and the memory of Nimitz's instructions. His primary mission was the protection of the Saipan operation. If he sailed far west, and if the Japanese sent even a portion of their surface force around his flank in the night, the transports off Saipan could be exposed. He would not permit that possibility, not while he could stand between the enemy and the beachhead. What he could not know at the time was that his reading of his opponent had merit. Ozawa had organized his force with a van group of 3 light carriers under Rear Admiral Sueo Obayashi, Chitose, Chiyoda, and Zuiho, steaming ahead of the main carrier groups. The Japanese formation was designed for a coordinated long-range strike, using distance and depth to their advantage. Whether Ozawa would have detached surface ships for a flanking attack on Saipan under different circumstances is a question historians still debate. Spruance did not need to know the specific Japanese order of battle. He knew the pattern. He respected the enemy. He would not be lured. That is the terror and the loneliness of high command. To make a call whose full justification you cannot yet see and may never see. On the 18th, radio intelligence placed a Japanese transmission far to the west-southwest. It was almost certainly Ozawa. On the flag bridge of the USS Lexington, Mark Mitscher and Arleigh Burke read the report and understood the moment. If they turned west now, they could close the distance during the day, launch a full strike at dusk, and be within reach at first light. Burke drafted a proposal to Spruance. The wording was measured. The wording was respectful. The proposal was to bring Task Force 58 to a westerly course to attack the enemy at dawn. Spruance refused. His reply was brief and firm. He would not turn his fleet west that night. That answer closed the door on everything Mitscher had planned. The greatest carrier strike force in the world would remain in position covering Saipan, while Ozawa closed the distance from the west. The response was not received well aboard the Lexington. By every account of officers present, there was frustration on the flag bridge that night. Mitscher, according to those who served with him, took the answer quietly. He had spent a career serving under commanders he did not always agree with. He would carry his disappointment inward, as he usually did. He believed his Aircrews would pay for Spruance's cautious caution. He was wrong about that particular fear. But he did not know he was wrong and would not know for months. That is the second tragedy of this story. Spruance on the Indianapolis was operating almost entirely on his own judgment. He had no confirmed intelligence of a Japanese night surface attack on Saipan. He had no captured document. He had only his reading of the enemy, his sense of what was at stake, and the promise he had made to Nimitz. He was, in effect, staking his career and the safety of tens of thousands of troops on an assessment he could not prove. He did not sleep. He walked. Dawn came on the 19th of June. Japanese scout planes appeared on the radar screens of Task Force 58. On the Lexington, Mark Mitscher gave the order that would define the rest of the day. Get the Hellcats up. Hundreds of F-6F Hellcat fighters roared off the decks of 15 American aircraft carriers. They climbed high above the fleet. They formed a defensive screen in the sky, a barrier between the Japanese fleet and the American ships. Below them, fighter direction officers on the carriers watched their radar screens and vectored fighters onto the incoming raids. At about 10 o'clock in the morning, the first wave came. Roughly 69 Japanese aircraft, Zeros, Judys, dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and their fighter escorts. They came in the formations Japanese pilots had once been famous for, believing they would sink American carriers before lunch. The Hellcats fell on them. Of that first wave, only a handful reached the American fleet. Roughly 42 aircraft were shot down. Their pilots, boys with only weeks of training, were no match for veteran American flyers in superior aircraft. Around 11 o'clock, the second wave came. More than 100 aircraft, around 70 shot down. Early afternoon, the third wave. Fewer than 50 aircraft. Only a fraction reached the American fleet. Late afternoon, the fourth and final wave. Around 80 aircraft. Most were shot down, scattered, or unable to find the American ships. Somewhere in the middle of it, a 25-year-old lieutenant named Alex Vrasiu, flying an F-6F Hellcat off the USS Lexington, sighted a formation of Japanese Judy dive bombers. In roughly 8 minutes of combat, Vrasiu shot down 6 of them. When he landed back aboard, he stepped out of the cockpit and held up 6 fingers to the deck crew. He became, on that day, the most successful single-mission American naval fighter pilot of the battle. By the end of the day on the 19th, Japanese aircraft losses in combat exceeded 350. American losses in aerial combat that day numbered fewer than 30. The pilots would soon give the day its name. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. But even as the sky above Task Force 58 burned with falling Japanese aircraft, something else was happening beneath the surface of the ocean, something that would change the balance of Ozawa's fleet before the day was out. That morning, the American submarine USS Albacore had spotted the newest and finest carrier in the Japanese fleet. Her name was Taiho. She was Ozawa's flagship. She had entered service only months earlier. The Albacore fired a spread of torpedoes. A young Japanese pilot named Warrant Officer Sakio Komatsu, just launched from the Taiho on patrol, saw a torpedo track heading for his ship. He deliberately flew his aircraft into the path of one of the torpedoes and destroyed it at the cost of his own life. He was in his early 20s. His sacrifice saved his ship for the moment. But another torpedo struck home. It tore into the forward hull of the Taiho, ruptured aviation fuel tanks, and set in motion a chain of failures that would destroy her from within. For hours, the Taiho steamed onward. She kept launching aircraft. Ozawa remained on her bridge. Below decks, fuel vapors from ruptured tanks and the volatile Borneo crude spread through the ship. In the afternoon, those vapors ignited. The Taiho exploded. Her flight deck buckled. Her hangar deck erupted in flame. She began to sink. Ozawa initially refused to leave. His staff eventually persuaded him to transfer his flag. He was moved by small boat to the cruiser Haguro. From there, he watched his newest carrier slip beneath the waves. He had lost his flagship. He had lost his primary means of communication for hours. He did not yet fully know the scale of the disaster in the air above him. He also did not know that not far away, another American submarine, the USS Kavala, had put 3 torpedoes into the veteran carrier Shokaku. The Shokaku had struck Pearl Harbor. She had fought at Coral Sea. She had survived a dozen battles. She would not survive this one. Fires spread. Ordnance detonated. She blew apart in a catastrophic explosion and went to the bottom. 2 Japanese fleet carriers destroyed in a single day by 2 American submarines, while the sky above the Philippine Sea filled with falling Japanese aircraft. On the American carriers, the pilots returned. They landed. They shouted. They pounded each other on the shoulders. They believed correctly that they had just fought one of the most one-sided air battles in the history of naval warfare. In the flag plot of the USS Lexington, Mark Mitscher stood over a chart. He believed that Task Force 58 had a chance to destroy far more of the Japanese fleet if it could close the distance now. Burke drafted another proposal to Spruance to move west and pursue. Spruance again declined for the night. This is the moment historians would argue about for decades, because at that point in the battle, Spruance still had no confirmed report of a specific Japanese night surface attack aimed at Saipan. He had a picture of the battle that was still incomplete. He had his judgment, his study, and his mission. He was once again staking everything on his own assessment. Dawn came again, the 20th of June. Spruance at last authorized the fleet to move west in pursuit, but Ozawa had already put hundreds of miles between himself and Task Force 58. He was near the outer edge of American strike range. He was almost gone. All morning, the American scout planes searched. All morning, they found nothing. The ocean is very large, and a fleeing fleet is a very small thing. Fuel gauges ticked down. Late in the afternoon, a scout plane from the carrier Enterprise found them, around 275 miles to the west-northwest, near the outer limit of what an American strike aircraft could reach and return from. At that range, if aircraft launched now, they would arrive over the enemy fleet near sunset. They would attack in fading light. They would fly home in darkness. Many of them would run out of fuel before finding their own decks. Mark Mitscher understood exactly what he was ordering. His officers understood. The pilots preparing on the flight decks understood. Just after 4 in the afternoon, Mitscher ordered the strike launched. More than 200 aircraft roared into the sky. Dive bombers, torpedo bombers, fighters. They climbed to attack altitude and turned west into the setting sun. They found Ozawa near sunset. The light was dying. The Americans fell on the Japanese fleet in a series of dive and torpedo attacks. The carrier Hio was struck, caught fire, and sank in the darkness. The carriers Zuikaku, Junyo, and Chiyoda were damaged. 2 Japanese oilers were set ablaze and later abandoned. And then the American pilots turned east and began the long flight home. The sun set behind them. The ocean turned black. Now came the part every pilot feared. Not combat. Fuel starvation. Empty tanks in a night sky over open ocean. Aircraft began to fall, one by one, not from enemy fire, from lost formations, lost bearings, empty tanks. Voices came in over the emergency channel. Voices of pilots who could not find their carriers. Voices of pilots who were watching their engines cough and die. On the flag bridge of the USS Lexington, Mark Mitscher listened. And then he did the thing that he would be remembered for as long as the United States Navy exists. He gave the order to turn on the lights. Every ship in Task Force 58, in the middle of enemy waters, in the middle of the night, switched on running lights, searchlights, signal lamps, and star shells. The fleet lit itself up in the dark. 15 aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, all of them visible from the air and also potentially to any Japanese submarine within range. It was a tactical risk with no perfect justification. It was also, in the eyes of every man in the fleet, an act of loyalty to the pilots in the dark. Mitscher's decision saved many. Roughly 80 aircraft went into the sea that night from fuel exhaustion or crash landings. The great majority of the crews who ditched were rescued in the hours and days that followed, plucked from the water by destroyers and float planes. That is the man Mark Mitscher was. He would light his fleet in a war zone to save his aircrews, and that, in the end, is why he could not agree with Raymond Spruance. Because Spruance served the mission first, Mitscher served the men first. Both principles are honorable. Both men were carrying burdens no one else could carry. The battle was over. Ozawa was withdrawing with only a few dozen aircraft left of the 450 he had started with. 2 of his frontline carriers were on the bottom of the Philippine Sea, along with a third from the 20th. His pilot corps, the trained and precious core of Japanese naval aviation, was effectively destroyed. He would never fight another carrier battle. Raymond Spruance had done what he was ordered to do. Saipan was safe. The transports were safe. The Marines and soldiers on the beach would take the island. The airfields would be built. The B-29 bombers would come. Tokyo would burn. But Mark Mitscher was standing on his flag bridge in the darkness, watching his lights burn in the empty ocean, grieving for the men who had died and for the more decisive victory he believed had slipped away. And the argument that would divide the United States Navy for years to come was about to begin. The morning of June 21st came gray and empty over the Philippine Sea. The last of Ozawa's ships were beyond the horizon. The turkey shoot was history. The night rescue was over. And in every wardroom, on every carrier, in every ready room across Task Force 58, a single question was being asked, quietly at first and then louder. Why did we not go west sooner? Raymond Spruance sat in the flag plot of the USS Indianapolis and drafted his after-action report. His words were careful. He made no attempt to defend himself in print. He described what had happened. He listed the Japanese aircraft destroyed. He listed the carriers sunk. He noted that the primary mission, the protection of the Saipan operation, had been accomplished. He signed his name, Mark Mitscher's report was different. It was controlled, it was professional. But between the lines, it made clear that Task Force 58 believed a greater victory had been possible with a different fleet disposition on the night of the 18th. The battle in the Philippine Sea was over. The battle for the memory of the Philippine Sea was just beginning. Some senior aviators in the Pacific Fleet, most notably Vice Admiral John Towers, had long argued that non-aviators like Spruance should not command carrier operations. That criticism grew louder after the Philippine Sea. Newspaper coverage in the weeks that followed sometimes suggested that a great victory had been squandered by an overcautious commander. But Chester Nimitz stood by him. So did Fleet Admiral Ernest King, whose reputation for being hard on subordinates made his endorsement all the more significant. The support of the two most senior officers in the Pacific effectively closed the question of Spruance's command. He would continue leading the Fifth Fleet into the campaigns still to come. Spruance himself gave no interviews on the controversy. He wrote no memoir. When later asked in private about his decision, he would say only that he had done what he thought was right at the time, with the information he had. He continued to command. He continued to walk his miles on the deck, and he waited. He would not have to wait long. 4 months. 4 months later, another answer would come. Not from Nimitz, not from King, not from any historian, from the ocean itself. It would come from Leyte Gulf, October 1944, the Philippines. General Douglas MacArthur had returned, as he had promised. American troops were pouring ashore on the island of Leyte, and once again a vast amphibious operation was underway. Once again, hundreds of ships lay off a hostile beach. Once again, the Imperial Japanese Navy was steaming to attack. But this time, the covering carrier force was not commanded by Raymond Spruance. This time, it was commanded by Admiral William Halsey. William Halsey was 61 years old. He was aggressive. He was profane. He was beloved by the press and adored by his sailors. He was, in temperament, the opposite of Raymond Spruance. At Leyte, the Japanese divided their fleet. They came at the American landings from more than one direction. And in the northern group, sailing as bait, was a name William Halsey knew well. Jisaburo Ozawa. Ozawa now commanded carriers with almost no aircraft on them. He was being sent north deliberately as a lure to pull Halsey's Third Fleet away from the San Bernardino Strait, to make the American commander do the very thing Raymond Spruance had refused to do at the Philippine Sea, to make him chase. On the afternoon of October 24th, American scout planes located Ozawa's force to the north. Halsey looked at the map, weighed the situation, and made his choice. He turned his fast carriers and battleships north. He did not leave a covering force at the San Bernardino Strait. He believed the main Japanese battle force under Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita had been so damaged in earlier air attacks that it no longer posed a serious threat. He was wrong. On the morning of October 25th, off the coast of the island of Samar, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's force of battleships and heavy cruisers emerged from the San Bernardino Strait. He turned south and steamed toward the American landings. Between his massive warships and the exposed transports and escort carriers, there stood a small task unit known to history as Taffy 3, 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, 4 destroyer escorts, slow, thin-skinned ships built to hunt submarines and support ground troops, not to fight battleships. They fought anyway. The destroyer USS Johnston, under Commander Ernest Evans, a Cherokee and Creek naval officer from Oklahoma, charged the Japanese battle line. Evans had told his crew when he took command of the Johnston that he never intended to run from a fight, and that any man not willing to face that possibility should get off his ship. He made good on that pledge at Samar. He put smoke on the water. He fired torpedoes. He engaged battleships and heavy cruisers with the Johnston's 5-inch until his ship was pounded apart around him. The destroyer USS Hole and the destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts followed. They too were destroyed. Escort carriers, ships never designed for surface combat, fired their single stern guns at cruisers many times their size. Aircraft flew from the escort carrier decks with whatever ordnance could be loaded, including depth charges meant for submarines, and made attack runs on Japanese warships, and made dry runs when their ordnance was gone to draw fire away from other ships. Ernest Evans went down with his crew. Hundreds of American sailors were left in the water for more than 2 days before rescue arrived. Sharks came for some of them in the dark, and then, with the American beaches within his reach, Takeo Kurita broke off the action, and turned north. Kurita, after the war, offered his own explanations. He believed, based on conflicting reports, that he was facing fleet carriers rather than escort carriers. He feared other American forces were closing on him. He judged that continued action would cost him what remained of his force without decisive result. His reasoning has never fully satisfied historians. But he turned. He left. The transports and beaches survived. William Halsey, chasing Ozawa's nearly empty carriers hundreds of miles to the north, received desperate calls for help from the beachhead. He turned south. He was too late to intervene at Samar. In the years after the war, the contrast between the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf became one of the defining lessons of the Pacific War. At the Philippine Sea, a cautious commander was criticized for not chasing. At Leyte, an aggressive commander was criticized for chasing. Halsey defended his own decision for the rest of his life, but the Navy as a whole absorbed the underlying lesson. There is a place for aggression. There is also a place for restraint. And the hardest part of high command is knowing which one the moment requires. Raymond Spruance had known in the darkness of a June jeet in 1944 which one his moment required. He had understood that his enemy would likely try to divide his attention. He had understood that a beaten fleet fleeing west was less dangerous, however uncertain, of a hit dangerous to his mission, of a hidden force reaching his transport. He had understood that the mission was not to sink every Japanese ship in the ocean. The mission was to protect the beachhead at Saipan. After the war, American investigators went to Japan and interviewed the surviving admirals of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Japanese naval doctrine of the period allowed for detached surface forces to strike amphibious operations under some circumstances. Whether Ozawa would actually have launched such a strike against the Saipan transports on the night of 18 June had Task Force 58 historians still weigh. Spruance's caution cannot be reduced to a simple vindication. But the possibility he was guarding against was not imaginary. It was, on the Japanese side, considered. Captain Yasuji Watanabe, a former staff officer for Admiral Yamamoto, spoke of Spruance after the war in words that have often been quoted. In imperfect English, he said Spruance had the best character of an admiral, strong, straight thinker, not impulsive. He aimed at the main point and did not stop. That was the enemy talking. Mark Mitscher never fully recovered from the war. He commanded Task Force 58 through Iwo Jima and Okinawa. He watched more of his aircrews die under the kamikaze. He drove himself past every limit. When the war ended, he was worn down in body and mind. His heart gave out in February of 1947. He was 60 years old. He had outlived the surrender of Japan by less than 2 years. Jisaburo Ozawa lived until 1966. He did not seek public office. He did not seek fame. He referred to himself to the end as a defeated admiral. And Raymond Ames Spruance? He commanded the Fifth Fleet through Iwo Jima. He commanded it through Okinawa. He faced the kamikazes and did not flinch. After the war, he was named president of the Naval War College, where he had studied and taught as a younger man. He was later appointed ambassador to the Philippines, the country he had helped to liberate. He retired to Pebble Beach, California. Near the ocean he had spent his life crossing. He walked every day. He read history. He answered polite letters from historians and old sailors. He never wrote a memoir. He never told his side. He never defended what he had done in the Philippine Sea, or at Midway, or at any of the other battles that had made him one of the most respected admirals in American history. When asked in old age whether he had any regrets about his wartime decisions, he answered simply that he had done what he thought was right at the time with the information he had. That was as far as he went. Raymond Spruance died on December 13, 1969, in Pebble Beach, California. He was 83 years old. He was buried at Golden Gate National Cemetery in San Bruno, California, near his wife Margaret, and not far from the grave of his old friend Chester Nimitz. The stone above him is plain. It gives his name, his rank, the dates of his life. It says nothing about the Philippine Sea. It says nothing about Midway. It says nothing about the night he sailed east while his carrier commanders wanted to sail west. He would have wanted it that way. He believed the man was not the point. He believed the mission was the point. He believed command was a burden to be carried, not a stage to be performed upon. He believed that if a commander did his job well, no one would ever have to know his name. But we know his name. We know it because on one night in June of 1944, in the darkness of the Philippine Sea, with his carrier commanders urging him to attack and his own reading of the enemy urging him not to. He made a choice. He chose the mission over the chance at greater glory. He chose the men on the beach over the enemy on the horizon. He chose to accept criticism, then and later, if that was the price of doing what he believed was right. He was 57 years old. He commanded the largest fleet the United States had ever put to sea. He stood alone on a bridge in the dark and made a decision that no one could confirm, and no one would thank him for at the time. He sailed east, and history in the end turned east with him. Today, if you visit Saipan, you can walk the beaches where those Americans landed. You can see where the airstrips were built for the B-29s that would carry the war to Tokyo. You can stand at the cliffs at the northern end of the island where thousands of Japanese soldiers and civilians chose death over surrender. The wind comes off the ocean the way it did that summer. The sand is the same sand. Part of the story of that place, and part of the story of what came after, is the story of one quiet admiral who, on one difficult night, refused to be lured and stood between the sea and the men on the beach. He is buried in a small plot in California. Very few people visit him. He would have preferred it that way. But if you had a father or a grandfather or an uncle who came home from the Pacific in 1945, there is a real chance that the decisions of men like Raymond Spruance are part of the reason your family gathered around a table when the war was over. Some names deserve to be remembered. His is one of them.